Series 4 of the 50 Faces podcast is sponsored by Baillie Gifford. Baillie Gifford is a long-term investment manager dedicated to discovering the innovations and change makers that deliver exceptional growth opportunities for its clients.
Read as much as you can and dance as much as you can.
I'm Aoife Devitt, and welcome to the 50 Faces podcast, a podcast committed to revealing the richness and diversity of the world of investment by focusing on its people and their stories. I'm joined today by Lauren Juliff, who's Climate and Sustainability Product Lead and Head of UK Institutional at Storebrand Asset Management UK. Her educational background is in maths, and she has an MSc in Climate Change, Environment, Science and Policy. Welcome, Lauren. Thanks for joining me today.
Thanks, Aoife.
I'm going to start by talking about your background. So I've sketched it a little in the bio above, but can you tell us how you went from into math initially and how from there into the world of investing?
Yeah, so I guess my background, my whole family actually is from the valleys in South Wales, but my parents moved to the north of England before I was born. So my dad was offered a professional rugby contract. He was a bit of a try-scoring star playing rugby union for Pontypridd in the late 70s. And then he went on to have this successful career playing rugby league for Wigan and Halifax in the 80s. So a lot of my early memories are like running around rugby clubs with other players' kids and even going to Wembley and taking the trophy to school. And I think back at this now, because it might not seem like such a huge deal now, but looking back and understanding those valleys communities at the time, I realised what a big move that was for my parents, but they were always adventurous and ambitious and kind of excited to try new things and experiences. So I think this really sort of feeds into my educational background and how I got into investing. I was the first generation to grow up in England with this accent, but also the first to go and get a degree at university. I was a really big reader from an early age. I always did well at school, particularly at maths. And our house was always full of books and music and dancing and fun. And my mum was a piano teacher. My parents were really sociable, always having parties and going out. And I often joke that I was like Safi from Ab Fab, if you remember that show, because I was so studious. But when it came to choosing A-levels, there was just never any doubt I was going to do maths. But I also loved art. So I'm one of those weird kind of creative mathematicians. And it was such an unusual A-level combination that it wasn't possible to do both in the timetable. But fortunately, my school allowed me to take art with the year above so I could do both. And I just loved it. But I remember vividly having this careers chat in the library at school, having no real idea about what I wanted to do. But the careers advice in my state school in the Northeast was so basic. And I just didn't know anything about investments or know anyone working in that industry. So when it came then to choosing my degree course, I just picked my favourite subject and I went off to study maths at university. I think that was pretty interesting first because there were plenty of girls in the top maths set at school, but when I arrived at my first lecture at university, I was very much in the minority. There was just a handful of girls on the whole course. And again, I think the careers advice at university was pretty limited. I heard a lot about accounting, actuarial science and banking, but none of those things really appealed to me so much. So I graduated and just moved down to London with a big group of friends and started looking for a job. And I think I kind of fell into asset management, really. I got a job at Fidelity working in the client support team out of university at 21 years old. I went on to Schroders a few years later. I was at Schroders for almost 10 years working in institutional business development, mainly with pension funds, and then heading up the DC business development before moving to Skagen Funds to head up their UK institutional business in 2013.
Well, I'd stop you there just before we move into the world of investment and your focus. First of all, the professional rugby background, I think some listeners are already flaming with jealousy because that must have been a fascinating backdrop that you seem to have just kind of grown up with and thought was maybe quite normal. But I'm sure lots of excitement, and you said the cup and everything. But you also, despite the creativity, which we'll also draw on later, I think, because being creative has a real role in the world of investment, I believe. You also have done dance, or at least dancing is a big part of your life as well.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Dancing is everything, really. I started at 4, so a ballet class when I was 4 years old. And I'm still dancing now over 40 years later. So I think it's given me so much throughout my life. When I was young, I think it was great for building confidence through performing and obviously maintaining fitness and strength and posture. But as I've gotten older, I've found a real community in it, and particularly a community of women. And like these wonderful women who come from really different backgrounds and careers to me, who just become really great friends. So now I dance still at least twice a week, not only because it helps me to keep fit, but it just brings me so much joy. And my teacher constantly comes up with new tracks and choreography to keep us on our toes, like quite literally. And it's just so good for stress. I think when you're dancing with a group to a routine, you have to be so focused on the choreography. You just can't be thinking about anything else. And I think it's probably also one of the reasons I come across as so animated when I'm presenting at events. Apart from obviously being passionate about the topic with climate change, which is what I do, I just also can't seem to tame the jazz hands.
I love it, that performer's enthusiasm and connection, which is why I asked about the dance, because not only I've had a number of interesting people who've done dance on this podcast, and the poise that they bring to their presence and entering a room, as well as their desire to connect with an audience and communicate through ways other than pure language and words. And just again, that creative aspiration, I think it all connects very much to what we're trying to achieve in our industry, even if it may seem a little drier than that on its face. So no, thank you for sharing that. And moving then to the world of sustainability and climate in particular, how did you start first getting interested in climate change? And I know you've pursued an MSc in this. And how did you apply it to your investment work?
So everything really changed for me in my career journey. So I was personally already interested in the environment. I was doing a lot of work in the local community on air pollution in schools. After I had my children, I was raising funds for air purification units in classrooms and green walls around the playground. And I was reading a lot about climate change, particularly after the Paris Agreement was signed. And I was just trying to make personal changes in my life to have as much impact as I could. So I was already vegetarian, but I became vegan. And then career-wise, so Storebrand bought Skagen funds in 2018, and I was at Skagen. And I realized then that I could bring this knowledge and passion for climate change to work. Everyone I spoke to at Storebrand was interested in sustainability. It came from the CEO right through the organization. And it was just clear that sustainability was properly embedded in the culture and the products. So it wasn't just an add-on. And that was just really exciting to me at that time. I met this climate specialist portfolio manager at Storebrand, Henrik Wald-Nielsen, and we hit it off straight away, talking about climate risk data, scenarios. The IPCC 1.5 degree report had recently been published, making it so clear that climate change was both a financially material risk and an opportunity for investors to consider. And Henrik had launched this product in 2016, which was aiming to address climate risk in an asset owner's core equity holding and deliver long-term alignment with the goals of the Paris Agreement. And I just thought this strategy was really unique and ahead of its time. This was before any talk of Paris-aligned benchmarks. And I started working with Henrik on bringing it into the UK for asset owners that were concerned about climate risk here. So while I was doing this work with Henrik, and after reading that 1.5 degree report, I realized I wanted to go back to university and study the science. In around that time, sort of 2018, 2019, there were a lot of companies and all industries jumping on the sustainability bandwagon. And often it didn't sit that well with me. And I wanted to learn from the experts so that I could talk about climate risk and climate science in a credible way. I was really fortunate that the head of our UK business, Tim Heffer, was also passionate about the environment. And he saw the benefits of the product for the UK market and of me having that knowledge and ability to talk to investors about climate risk with that sort of scientific integrity. So I found the course that I wanted to do, which was an MSc in climate change at KCL, King's College London. And I started studying part-time in 2019 while still working full-time in my role at Storebrand. I just loved it. The course leader was one of the lead IPCC authors. I was immersed in something that I knew I could apply directly to my work. And those two things just really came together for me. I think particularly because I'd been working with LGPS funds for 20 years, and I knew there was a worthwhile piece of research that could be done there on climate risk and governance. So I wrote my dissertation on the management of climate-related investment risk in the LGPS, and I won the Best Thesis Award for that. And then I graduated and just carried on writing research, really. And there's just been so much to research and write about on how climate data and climate science has been applied in our industry and in regulations over the past 6 years or so. So Henrik and I have now written, I think, about 8 white papers together now on the use of climate data in portfolio construction. And I've also responded to a lot of government consultations on the topic, as well as presented our research at investor events, and more recently doing some guest lecturing at universities as well.
I'd love to know what some of the topics of those white papers are, and equally delivering white papers in this industry has changed a little bit. The attention span of readers has changed. What do you find is good in terms of actual vehicle for delivering these, and what are the themes that you're writing about today?
So, as I said, I work with large institutional asset owners, including LGPS clients and pools. So I'm always thinking, I think, about the issues that really matter to the investor, to the client that we're speaking to. So it's not so abstract. And, one thing, for example, at the moment is in working with these big pools and clients, the Mansion House reforms are very much in focus. So I used our research to respond to the LGPS Fit for the Future consultation earlier this year, because my research project, where I'd interviewed decision makers and advisors in the LGPS, led me to some interesting conclusions on LGPS pooling and governance that I think are really relevant to the reforms and ongoing challenges in that area. So in that response, I put forward that the new proposal doesn't address one of the fundamental challenges with the pooling project so far. And principally, our feedback that we gave to the consultation was that the government's proposals and approach to pooling has suffered because there hasn't been this focus on sustainable investment beliefs at a fund level. And if you think about this in terms of the timing, so the initial guidance on pooling was published in 2015. And that's significant because it was also the year that the Paris Agreement was established. And after that, governments, companies, investors all began to appreciate this financially material risk that is associated with climate change. And then, I've mentioned the IPCC report in 2018. That highlighted the potential economic pathways to a future aligned with the goals of the Paris Agreement. And what followed then, I think, was this substantial shift in the way that institutional asset owners were approaching sustainable investing. And then, we saw the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance established and the suite of tools and guidance for setting Paris-aligned or net zero investment strategies becoming available, like Science-Based Targets Initiative, Transition Pathway Initiative, IIGCC, and, so many others. And for me, the LGPS was really at the forefront of that sustainable investing revolution in the UK. And now about half of LGPS funds have a net zero target or ambition. But what's crucial is that I think the fund's strategies for achieving those goals vary hugely. They've got different philosophies, approaches, target dates ranging from 2030 to 2050. Half of funds don't have a net zero commitment. And pools aren't alliances that were created based on sustainability or net zero policies. So the design and execution of climate policy in a pool is therefore pretty challenging. And to co-invest, funds need to agree on a strategy. But if they've all got different approaches and targets, that pooling sort of loses its purpose. So I think under that current pooling model, a one-size-fits-all approach has just not been reasonable because of the decision-making hierarchy and variation in local stakeholders and different interpretations of fiduciary duty and sustainable responsible investing in the LGPS. And I think that in a model where funds retain the responsibility for high-level investment objectives, including sustainable investment strategy, but where pools aren't alliances created on those high-level beliefs, that pooling will be problematic. And an area where it's become really apparent is in the management of passive listed assets, in line with a variety of different approaches to managing climate risk and target setting. So a lot of the work that Henrik and I have done has been looking at sort of how we understand climate risk using the data that is available to us and how we implement that in portfolio construction, how we report on it. And more recently, our most recent white paper was on the topic of Paris-aligned portfolios in this new Trump era and amongst the so-called ESG backlash. So that's something I've been focusing on with clients recently. And so the title of that was about the future of Paris-aligned investing, and the subtitle was what gets mismeasured gets mismanaged. And so, yes, Trump is a setback, but global warming is exactly that. It's global. It will continue to pose a threat for investors far beyond the next 4 years. And climate change continues to be a financially material consideration for investors. And there are powerful long-term trends towards decarbonisation by countries and companies all over the world. But I think the real problem for Paris-aligned investing remains how we define and measure Paris alignment. And this sort of simple EU-defined and regulation decarbonisation trajectory is not the answer. So in our latest paper, we talk then about that and demonstrate that Paris alignment, according to EU benchmark rules, is not the same as financial alignment with the Paris Agreement goals. And that actually some Paris-aligned benchmarks counterintuitively outperformed on the news that Trump had won the US election. And we also look at the divergence in performance of different Paris-aligned benchmarks and where risk comes from. And the reasons behind that being that there is no single way to define a Paris-aligned portfolio or company climate risk. And that's generally pretty counterintuitive to the mindset or goals of a passive investor. So yeah, all that work that Henrik and I have done over the past 5 years has been focused on highlighting some of those unintended consequences from bundling Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3 emissions data together and using it indiscriminately as a climate risk indicator across all companies and industries. And then we've gone on to offer solutions to that and shown that portfolio decarbonisation as an approach is useful for addressing climate-related risk. But it really requires a nuanced understanding of emissions exposures, particularly that Scope 3 metric, and some consideration of avoided emissions to discern between what are climate positive and climate negative exposures. So we think that it's more effectively determined by a range of metrics when we're thinking about climate risk, and also looking at some forward-looking solutions as well.
It's fascinating. Nuance is a word I would have used, and you just used it in terms of your approach, which is exactly what has often been lacking in some of the more kind of absolute positions and definitions. And perhaps, the pendulum did swing towards mismeasuring. And I think I love that mismeasurement and mismanagement. What would you say is resonating most with clients? And when you go around and meet with clients, how do you find their needs are changing or evolving, and what are they focused on today?
Yeah, so I think that depending on the types of clients we're talking to, I think because we're a firm that is still very committed to sustainable investing, the ESG backlash is something that we still get asked about very regularly. From my perspective, sustainable investment, it is not going anywhere. I think the language will change, it is changing. And I think we're now seeing which companies and investors really take climate and sustainability risk seriously as a financial risk and as part of their fiduciary duty, but also as an opportunity for the long term. In terms of how things will change and evolve, I think that the voice of the asset owner is going to become increasingly powerful and important. And I think that's a really good thing. I think we'll see strong partnerships between truly engaged asset owners and asset managers, and more of a focus on systemic stewardship where policy engagement plays a part. And I think those partnerships are really crucial in how we sort of move forward in engagement and ESG integration and interaction going forward. In terms of integration, I think that the regulation and the data will keep evolving. It's absolutely necessary. We've still got a long way to go in understanding these risks. And I think that what we do need to do is embrace the complexity. We've got to stop trying to oversimplify a really complex and evolving problem to a single number, and maybe take a step back and learn from some of those mistakes on climate risk and regulation.
That's really interesting. Embracing complexity. I think I just recorded a podcast where we talked about systems thinking and how it's often seen as too hard, whereas there are some individuals who run into complexity and just can't get enough of complex problems to solve, whereas others will do the opposite and kind of try to oversimplify and maybe avoid the topic or kick the can down the road. So do you see that we will do more systems thinking? It is complex, certainly the whole idea. It took me a few podcasts to even learn what the term meant. But I would say that it seems increasingly to try to get the focus off narrowly a carbon focus and onto just a much broader holistic focus.
Yeah, I do think that holistic focus is really important. And I think we're hearing a lot more asset owners and asset managers talking about nature and climate risk now as very much intertwined. And, Storebrand last year published our joint climate and nature report where we're reporting on both of those things. And again, I think we need data, and we have some data. It's not perfect, but we do have enough to move forward with, and we have to use it. But again, I think, as I said, just appreciate the complexity of it. And yeah, probably some more bigger picture systemic thinking, as you say. And then I think that really will feed into engagement and stewardship. I mentioned policy engagement. There are some really good examples of that happening in the industry already on topics like deforestation, for example, which really needs that systemic stewardship. And it needs the right sort of policy environment for companies to be able to do some of the things that we're asking them to do in engagement.
And speaking of one aspect of ESG, the S and diversity, which is we've talked about on this podcast now for 5 years. Yeah. 5 years is even a cycle in which you'd expect to see change, but unfortunately, it's kind of the same conversation I'm having. Any observations on that? You've been in the industry for most of your career in terms of whether we're doing better in looking like the constituents that we serve.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really difficult one. I get asked about it because I've been speaking at universities recently. And my thoughts on the current levels of diversity in our industry are still pretty much what diversity. I am the only female in my office at the moment, and I'm the only woman in the international leadership team. But I'm not only talking about gender diversity. I've always felt like I stuck out, not only being female in senior roles, but even being Northern, being Welsh, not having been to private school. I think our industry still has a huge diversity challenge that needs to be addressed at all levels. And, I sort of done this guest lecturing recently at universities on the topic of the use of climate data in portfolio construction and Paris alignment. And I've then also been asked to talk to students on sustainability courses at two different universities about careers in finance. I think role models are really important. There have been very few for me, unfortunately, as I've gone through the industry. We've got to get more women into those senior CEO and CIO roles, heading departments. I think that means addressing the maternity and paternity leave discrepancy. It's something they do well in the Nordics. Having a baby and a young child shouldn't be seen as a challenge for women in an organization, but something that everyone understands as part of life. My husband's just as involved as I am in our family, in some areas even more. But I think although there is more flexibility for men to take maternity leave in the UK now, they still feel some stigma from doing so because it's not the norm. And that just doesn't exist in the Nordics. Men take really long periods of paternity leave and are interchangeable with the women on maternity leave as well. So it's not an issue. We've got women in the office, they're going to go on maternity leave. Well, men are also going to go on paternity leave. I think there's also that foundation level, getting more diversity into asset management organizations in the first place. Again, not only gender diversity, role models there are really important, but so is the reputation of our industry. I think we're going through this huge economic transition. Our industry needs to evolve rapidly. What that means in my mind is that diversity is essential. We need different ways of understanding and communicating risk. Communicating risk, I think that's a really important thing as well. We've got to let go of some outdated beliefs and embrace change. And for me, a really powerful way of attracting, motivating, and retaining talent is this is obviously a hugely intellectually stimulating industry, but we also have a purpose. And one of the most powerful ways we can tackle the climate crisis is through our savings and pensions. People are notoriously disengaged from their pension savings, but I think this is a way to improve the profile and reputation of asset management and encourage more diverse applicants. But that really does rely then, I think, on leadership at the top of organizations to see the benefits of sustainability and diversity and be prepared to challenge age-old recruitment criteria, even just looking more broadly at different courses at universities. Yeah, I've spoken to students on sustainability graduate courses at university, and they all say that it's really tough for them to get into the graduate programs in our industry because they're so focused on getting people from finance and economics and maths backgrounds. They're not really looking in those different geography departments where they are studying sustainability risk. It's climate science, it's things that matter to our industry and how we understand risk. So I think it's really important that, we broaden that recruitment criteria.
It's a difficult topic to talk about, and it's, because it keeps changing. So I'd love to move on. I think excellent points, and I completely agree about the role models. And that's why we have this podcast now with over 400 role models, hopefully, that people can look to draw on their wisdom, their experience, because, we have our own channels, but don't necessarily get exposure to the range of experience. I'd love to now move to some personal reflections. So I always have a question about setbacks and challenges that you've experienced in your career. And I think I could extend that in your case to some of the challenges for this whole area of the industry, given the headwinds and the policy changes that we're seeing, which, we did think we were on one trajectory, and now it seems that the global experience is on a different pace. I'd love to know what you've learned from some of the setbacks and challenges that you've experienced in your career.
Yeah, so, over a 20-year career, I've learned so much, obviously, from working in different organizations and cultures, challenging market environments, asset manager mergers. But I think the most challenging thing I've ever done career-wise was working full-time in a senior position while studying for a master's part-time and then going into lockdown with two young children being sent home. So I was just working around the clock, and the subject matter I was studying was pretty intense. I was really absorbed by climate science and policy and really concerned. So I understand that term eco-anxiety that you hear a lot now. And I really thought a lot at that time about what I could do, what impact I could have. And I think that is to focus on the areas where you can make a change and do what you can and educate yourself and others. You said about this environment that we're in now and the path that we've been on and where we're going. it's a transition. It's a huge transition. It's something of the scale that none of us have experienced before. So it's going to be challenging. And I think, again, it's embracing change. It's embracing diversity. It's embracing the challenge and the complexity of it, appreciating that we don't know everything yet. We haven't got everything right. Things will change in the future, and doing the best with what information that we do have.
And when it comes to any mentors or leaders, you've mentioned working with Heinrich and how much of a team you represent in terms of taking the story on the road and developing it further. Have there been any particular role models for you that have influenced your approach to life and career?
Yeah, I mean, definitely my colleague Henrik Wall-Nelson. He was hugely inspiring at a point in my career where I really needed some direction. I think he'd built a fantastic product. He's so knowledgeable and great to collaborate with. So I'm really proud of that work that we've done together in writing our white papers over the past few years. I think another sort of mentor and influence has been Tim Heffer. He was so supportive when I was changing that focus of my career towards climate and sustainability. He was the managing director of the UK business at the time, and he was just really encouraging about my work and my potential. And we started this Storebrand UK business together and brought in the first clients and built up that brand. And I think we made a really good team. Personally, I also have to say that something that's really influenced me more recently is my mum. So she died last year and she was only 69. So she was really young, but she was also really youthful and full of life and energy. So it was devastating when she was diagnosed with this rare blood cancer a few years ago. And then watching her go through the most brutal treatment. She had a stem cell transplant, but she didn't survive it. But she was so brave and positive right up until the end. She'd been a big campaigner for human rights and against Brexit in her last few years. She spent so many hours outside Parliament with her flag, marching through the streets, but always with this huge smile on her face, always meeting new people, making friends everywhere she went. So although losing her so young was devastating, it's also left me with this real feeling of, well, yeah, you only get one life. So you've got to go out there and live it, and preferably with a smile on your face, get out and do something meaningful and positive.
What an incredible role model. And it's no surprise that you are carrying the torch now in your own form of activism. So thank you for sharing that. My last question is any words of wisdom you might have for us in terms of a creed or motto, advice for your younger self, anything you wish you had known sooner?
Yeah, I think, I've spoken about the sort of influence that my family, I think, had on my life. I think because they were really energetic and enthusiastic people and really engaged. And I've got this amazing granny who's almost 92 now and an absolute legend. She was the mayor of Pontypridd and she's been really involved in her community. And from a really young age, I learned from them that you can make change happen. So I remember my great granny talking to me about women's suffrage, and I was always being told that voting was not only my right, but it was my responsibility. I've also got this pretty no nonsense family. There's always a sense of, well, if you don't like it, take action. Don't sit around and moan about it, do something. So I'm pretty practical. I'll always find a solution. And I think that that's kind of my approach to life, really, is you can do it, give it a try, be the change. And importantly, I think represent that change. There might not have been that many role models that looked or sounded like me in my career or educational background, but I can be that now for the next generation. So it's important for me to do things like this. So thank you, Ethan, for inviting me, and also the public speaking that I do. And there's this example that I've been giving to young people recently when I've been talking to them about careers advice in universities. There's a brilliant campaign by Project Drawdown called Climate Solutions at Work, which essentially says every job's a climate job. So whatever you're doing, you can find ways to have an impact. And in terms of like advice for my younger self, I think I'd probably say the sort of things that I say to my children now. I mean, not like tidy your room and don't leave your socks on the sofa, but don't be afraid to be different. Don't feel intimidated because you are different. Actually, and I say this to my daughter all the time, being different is your superpower. And I love that quote by Maya Angelou, which is that people won't remember what you said or what you did, but they'll remember how you made them feel. And I just think that's a really important philosophy for life and how we treat people, but particularly when it comes to communicating about difficult topics like climate change. Leaving people feeling fear and confusion or hopelessness is just not helpful. So yeah, I think that would be, and then I think I'd say to my younger self, just read as much as you can and dance as much as you can.
Well, we couldn't end it better than that. Thank you so much, Lauren. I think your joy, the way you made me feel, came through a LinkedIn post, which is an extraordinary way to convey joy and enthusiasm. But that was something that I read in one of your posts. I think it did refer to jazz hands. But it was just that sheer engagement and clear joy in the content you were delivering, which is probably something to do with sustainability, that it really focused me on getting you as a guest on this podcast. So thank you so much for coming here, keeping us up to date on the nuance in this area, and for sharing your other insights with us.
Thanks so much, Aoife. I really enjoyed it.
I'm Aoife David. Thank you for listening to the 50 Faces podcast. If you liked what you heard and would like to tune in to hear more inspiring investors in their personal journeys, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts.
This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be construed as investment advice, and all views are personal and should not be attributed to the organisations and affiliations of the host or any guest.